My name is Deshaun Johnson. I am a sixth grade student activist from Morrill Elementary, located on the south side of Chicago. In 2013, Rahm Emanuel tried to close my school. I fought back. Since over 50 public schools have closed, there have been an increase in budget cuts. No, there have been massive budget cuts, an increase in charter schools, and 5,000 plus teacher and staff layoffs. Programs have been cut like music, art, library, and sports. Public education is under attack in cities all over America.
Education is our only political safety. Outside of this ark, all is deluge. Horace Mann. Since 1995, the number of public school closures has doubled. The hope was that closing poorly performing schools would allow students to be relocated to better performing schools. But the cost of closure, the disruption to marginalized communities, and the children themselves are the unintended consequences of this strategy. Between 2019 and 2020, there were 1,130 school closures. Before the No Child Left Behind legislation, the annual closure rate averaged fewer than 1,000 schools annually. After No Child Left Behind, the closure rate increased dramatically, averaging 1,500 to 2,000 schools per year. The hidden costs of school closures are many, and we'll discuss what really happens to children, parents, and educators when schools close.
We will visit school systems in other parts of the world that are doing it right and ask America, why in Chicago, one of the epic centers of this country, are we using an education strategy that has repeatedly failed? Now, the affluent children are doing fine, but in our communities, we are being strangled. And it's not bad teachers, it's not bad parents, it's a sick school system.
Tell it.
It's a sick school system.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another segment of TAB Talks. And tonight we have a very special guest, Professor Duncan Shippey. Welcome to TAB Talks, Professor Shippey.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here this evening.
Well, I'm excited because we're going to be talking about why schools are closing, and you have done some phenomenal work in this area. And I was just so excited when I looked at your CV and saw her tremendous work, people. I mean, Google her, read her work. It is fantastic and it's illuminating. So, I certainly was not as aware as I should have been of the trend that we're seeing in this country. And so I'm so glad that Dr. Duncan Shippey is with us today. And I might say Professor Doctor. Okay. Well, let's try to get that straight. Okay, I've done some research because I had to be ready for you now.
Yes, okay.
So, according to the American Bar Association, there was an article from Catherine Gladson, and she talked about these school districts that were closing, and they've offered a myriad of reasons. One of which, of course, is always, academic performance, underutilization, and then kind of a hybrid of both. But your research has informed you also in this area. And so can you share from our audience what your research has informed you about school closures?
Sure. So I really came to this work thinking about how we can craft good education policy. How do we think about schools as community building institutions and attempt to leverage some of that? And so when I began to see reports in the late 90s and early 2000s about schools closing, multiple school closures, mass school closures in many of our major cities, I began to wonder what was going on. So I looked at these patterns at the national level using federal data from the National Center for Education Statistics and began to trace some of the trends that we were seeing, because I was interested in examining whether these patterns were evident nationally or if this was something unique to major cities and some of the education policy changes that we were seeing there. And the short of it, just what I found in the beginning of this work was that there were far more schools that had closed than I was aware of. So for example, the analysts at the National Center for Education Statistics reported that between 1999 and 2013, which is really what I would say covers the peak of these school closures, of the more recent school closures, during this window, we see that 24,000 public schools closed. And on average, these closures, so each year by my calculations, these closures were displacing about 250,000 public school students. I looked more closely at who those students were, and I saw that disproportionately these students were African American or Black students, and they were students who qualified for a free or reduced lunch, which the free or reduced lunch measure is a proxy we use for students who are living in poverty. So we're seeing schools closing at higher rates and displacing our African American students and students living in poverty. So, you take a closer look at some of the geographic patterns. Okay, so these are in majority African American, majority Black districts. You take a closer look again, though, and you're beginning to see a pattern like these closures are happening in the areas within cities that are usually those that have the highest poverty rates, those that have the greatest social strain, and those that have the weakest tax bases. And so for me, thinking about what role we want public schools to play, that was really the beginning of this research project. But to answer your question about the kind of key drivers, we hear a host of reasons from district officials, ranging from declining enrollment, which I found evidence that is a key driver of this upsurge in school closures. But then there were others related to academic achievement, for example, or financial strain, both of which are ongoing concerns. So it didn't really provide much insight into the timing of closures. And so that required a different type of study, which I know we plan to talk about a little bit later. But just with respect to those official reasons that were offered, what I found evidence of, there's certainly demographic changes. So we have city populations declining, or I should say depopulation in many of our cities. We have, of course, the expansion of school choice policies, and in some states that includes vouchers for private schools, in addition to charter schools and magnet schools. During this kind of the worst of the closures, we also, in addition to having kind of economic strain, we had the global recession of 2007 through 2010. And so that had ripple effects in the following years. But I think the reasons that I'm especially concerned about, and the ones that, if in any respect could have been prevented, would be those tied to school accountability. And the shift in the early 2000s towards the No Child Left Behind policy, which was very controversial when it was passed. This shift to thinking about schools almost exclusively in achievement terms and evaluating schools almost exclusively based on standardized test results, but without factoring in the different conditions in which schools are operating. And so in that regard, many critics, myself included, saw closures in some ways as punitive and punishing schools and punishing districts. And so I think there are multiple factors at play here. When I think about this work, again, I like to focus on some of the short and long-term social impacts that our decisions will have on young people, on the staff and educators at schools. But what we've really been seeing, at least from my research, that there's more evidence to suggest that policy decisions, administrative restructuring, the expansion of desegregation efforts, or retracting those efforts, rolling back those efforts, are really what we see as triggering the actual closures, as opposed to a specific test score one year. I think that has become, in some ways, a convenient justification for something larger. And I'm hoping to report back soon. I've been doing some work trying to see if these school closures are at all tied to economic development or redevelopment efforts. We're seeing uneven patterns there. In some places, yes, in other places, no. So we're really trying to kind of tap into why we see this recurrent pattern. I would say that's the other thing. I entered this work in the late 90s, but when I went back, I saw other waves of mass school closure. So while this seemed new to me, looking back in a longer stretch, there were certainly other waves of mass schools closures, and the pattern of these closures disproportionately affecting Black families and communities was also consistent. And that's consistent in city districts as well as suburban and rural districts.
So I guess we look at the common denominator is Black, whether it be urban, suburban, or rural. Okay, you brought up an interesting point. Let's get to the measures about performance when we talk about standardized tests. And we all know that standardized testing has always had a negative impact on minority students in low income districts. And we should have anticipated that if that was going to be the bar, those areas and those communities would be hit the hardest. What do you have to say about that? Because it's really alarming and disturbing to me that we would say performance was a justification, particularly when we're talking about poor students and poor districts.
Well, I think your question hits my concern spot on with respect to the support that we are providing students who are living and learning in districts that are strained, that are under strain, particularly financial or economic strain. For me, thinking about the use of standardized test scores, one big piece of it that I don't think gets enough attention is how much schools do in terms of keeping achievement gaps from growing larger. There's a new body of work that's come out to demonstrate basically contrasting students who are attending school year round or contrasting students who have summer learning time with those who do not. And they've been able to demonstrate that schools who do not, it's a seasonally adjusted learning, I think is how they talk about it now. They've been able to demonstrate that schools have been able to, for lack of a better term, compensate for out of school differences in resources and really kind of stand in the gap there when they have these additional learning opportunities. And so it really is helping. And I don't see that in the achievement, in the standardized achievement test conversation. There's a lot about how schools are replicating inequality or how schools aren't doing enough to close the gap, but I don't think that we're giving enough credit there. The flip side of that is we're asking schools to close something that I believe we created in society. I think that, and when I teach this to my students, I think that the test scores and the rankings that we assign to schools measure the degree to which they're operating in a context where they have the necessary resources. And I mean human, social, economic, I mean the full scale of resources there, where they have the support, where they have the connections with community. I mean, the list goes on and on. I think that when we see those low scores, it's less about students and the potential of students, and it's even less about teachers' commitment and their efforts. And I think it's more about some of these social issues that we've created in really through division. I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. The ways in which our school districts have emerged, the ways in which we've tied schools and home value, the ways in which we've really been able to isolate ourselves at times from different groups with whom we don't want to interact. When we see all these patterns happening across generations, we also see those resources and opportunities to build wealth uneven across those generations as well and across places. And so what we're seeing now in many cities is the outcome when we see these mass closures is really not the outcome of just something or decisions since 1990. This has really been ongoing cumulative effects of bad policy decisions and how we interact, particularly with majority Black communities, but also it has to do with the uneven opportunity with respect to development and building a strong tax base and maintaining a strong tax base, it could be something as simple as maintaining school buildings and just having deferred maintenance. I found that here, deferred maintenance on buildings, I saw maintenance reports from the 90s and from the 80s that were saying that these buildings had issues and it was just deferred. It wasn't a priority and let me say, I do not envy district officials. They're not operating under easy conditions and making decisions about how to allocate resources. And so I understand you might not prioritize building maintenance, but deferring it over decades obviously leads to problems. And so building costs and with respect to the number of students per building with the underutilization concerns, that tipping point in many of our older city districts is coming up. And then I also worry about lead.
You brought up an interesting point. I want to go back to that because you talked about the year-round school and the potential academic gap, the gap that could potentially be closed. But if you juxtapose that against, of course, shortages of teachers,
right?
Then you also have to look at unions that these schools are members of, saying, you know what, we are already potentially dissatisfied with the conditions that we have, and now you want us to teach year round. There better be some compensation,
right? Right.
Year-round school, and I think it's the perfect storm because you have these policy decisions, which clearly were policy decisions to defer maintenance, to not really have strong plans to help academic performance. Because I know when you look at a lot of the literature, it talks about that academic performance is directly tied to parental involvement. But you don't really look at the socioeconomic impact of what's happening in some of these communities. When you say, well, your child's not successful because you weren't involved. When there are a lot of parents, I think, that have the mindset, when I send my kid to school, I send them to school so you could educate them, not to send me home, send them home for me to educate them. And it's a flawed way to think, but I think many communities do feel that it's the school's job to educate their children. And, if I have to help with homework, so be it. But at the end of the day, so I think they have the perfect excuse to say, well, if academic performance is low, it's because you and the family, you weren't helping as much as the teachers in the classroom. So I don't know which side of the argument to argue, because you could argue both sides.
Right.
He makes interesting points.
Right. And I do see concerns about parent involvement or parent engagement. I've also seen, so there's I wish I would have actually thought to bring some of her work with me today. There's a graduate student who's at my university right now, and she is examining measures of parent involvement. Her argument is that many standardized measures miss how certain communities are involved. And it misses some of the culturally specific approaches to engagement. So it might not be so much I attend a PTO meeting, but it might be I've talked to you about having a positive attitude towards your schooling opportunities, X, Y, and Z, so you have the right disposition. Or it might not be, I might not be helping you with your algebra homework, but I will make sure that you are listening to your algebra teacher and you're going to your lunch tutoring sessions. And so her argument is that, the research does demonstrate that there are differences across race, ethnicity, and different parenting styles, but she's arguing that perhaps some of our measures are still missing some of that. Wow. That said, though, there has been a shift I would say in teacher preparation with more emphasis on parents as partners, for example. That's a phrase that we like to use when working with new teachers, or thinking about community engagement in a more expansive way. But I don't necessarily think that that shift is a mainstream shift. I think that's a teacher education shift. And I don't think that even just a generation ago, well, I won't say just with schooling. I think with parenting in general, the expectations are much higher. Like, not to be funny, but I don't remember my parents like getting on the floor playing with us often. Not saying it didn't happen, like, or that they didn't play with us or we played outside. But I see parents now where it's just a different, we're playing on the floor together for hours. And I think that's great. There's not a critique, but I think some of it are kind of cultural shifts, especially with those who are going into teaching and the communities that they're engaging. I'm seeing people trying to close those gaps with what they call like grow your own teacher programs. I don't know if you've heard of those. So there will be like pipeline programs in local school districts, and where they're trying to build the like scholarships for students who might be from high poverty backgrounds, and they can attend universities and pursue education if that's what they're interested in. So I'm seeing places experimenting or at least discussing these types of ideas to try to close this gap and strengthen those social connections between communities and schools. But again, and I think I touched on this a bit earlier, I think we put a lot on schools with respect to resolving our social issues. And I think our social issues are much larger than schools. And in fact, I think schools in many respects are some of the only places where we encounter people who are not like us. And so I think in that regard, they play very, very critical roles to where we are, or let's say where we want to be as a society, for those of us who are more committed to a more harmonious collective life. We don't have to be best friends or kumbaya, but we can be a little less contentious and polarized. And so I think when we begin to see the value that schools add, and not just see them as places of status and competition, because that's a lot of what they have been reduced to, we can move beyond some of this very polarized education policy discourse. I mean, because I'm worried about where we're headed. I'm worried about the educational context. So if we have families, which we're seeing families leave city districts in droves, even before COVID. We know concerns about housing costs, concerns about safety, and concerns about school quality are driving those. So some folks stay, they have a great charter school that they found, or a great magnet school that they found. But my worry is now we've reached a point in many districts where those trusting relations are just gone. And families really have no reason to stay in a district, and the district hasn't followed through on enough of its commitments to retain families. And so for me, I worry a bit that city districts are, for lack of a better term, are becoming, I don't know, that's a little bit too strong. I was getting ready. I was gonna say, one question that does bother me, like, are city districts becoming obsolete? We already see in New Orleans, 90+% of students are in charter schools there. And so we see in other major cities, more than half, almost half of students here in St. Louis are in charter schools. Same with Kansas City. So we see DC, we see this pattern time and time again. I think that many families have indicated that they're dissatisfied with district schools, but I don't necessarily think we've taken that feedback seriously. And so some of my future work is looking at the demands of parents with respect to what they want from schools now, not what we think they want, not what we're arguing about on their behalf, but actually listening to parents and saying, what do you expect of schools? What does a good education look like to you? we're out here fighting about curriculum, and I'm not sure as many parents care about the critical race theory, non-critical race theory argument as we are making it out to be. I think it's become politicized, but I don't think that it's the first concern or the main concern that many parents have. I think they want their student, their young person, to feel like they're accepted, like they're in community, that they're seen and heard and appreciated wherever they are. And I think it's just unfortunate that I believe most parents would agree on that point, that they want their child to feel that way. But we keep getting stuck on this idea, well, if your child feels like they're in community, mine will feel outside, and vice versa. And I think that there's a middle ground there that we just are refusing to see at right now.
I'm going to go back to a point you made. You know, when John Dewey first talked about the role of education, I'm going way back. So for my academic scholars out there, he talked about one of the main roles of education was socialization. But I don't think he could have predicted that teachers would end up getting into the business of sociology and dealing with a lot of the things that they're now having to deal with. I don't think anyone expected the schools to stand in the gap to do that. So we look at the school's role, and you talked about 250,000 individual students being displaced. What is that displacement doing to their education? Because I know, you know, like you said, when we're talking about what parents really want out of education, I know generationally, my parents wanted me to be college ready. I have the same goal for my children. I wanted them to be college ready coming out of a school. But now you hear people talking about trade schools, not necessarily being college ready. So I think that the demands that are being placed on teachers is like, I just want a decent human being. I think if you talk to most parents, I want somebody who can read basically, can have decent communication, can be self-sufficient, and it may not be they have to be college ready. And so I think this choosing of boutique schools, because again, we glamorize education. We have to be in the best schools,
right?
Communities, in the best
right.
And I don't know that those numbers are showing that those children are any more promising than some of these really bright, educated kids that are coming out of urban areas. But I think the segregation of and I hear what you're saying, that our public schools becoming obsolete, because I think people equate public with poor. And so if I don't want my kids going to school with poor children, my option is I'm going to put them in an elite school somewhere in suburbia where I can say my kids have arrived. And I know that's a lot of my question, but to me, what I'd like to know is, what is all this movement doing to these kids?
Well, so one of the things that we know with just the announcement that closures are being considered, there's a dip in test scores for students, and that's pretty much across the board. We also see we begin to see teachers leaving fairly quickly. And I think what's been a little shocking for me is kind of when these announcements happen. I've known families who've been in schools in mid-October. They would have notice, a 2-week notice, that the school was closing its doors, and they would have to scramble to find a new school.